Good evening, everyone. Welcome to St. Michael's Catholic Community. Father Edmund here, the shepherd pastor. I would like to introduce to you shortly, in a brief way, our facilitator for tonight. And Monsignor Fred Dolan is of the Opus Dei. Opus Dei in English means work of God. They are doing the work of God. We all are doing the work of God. But anyway, we have a long history of being friends. I met him first when I was at Sacred Heart Church. We would host them there for their outreach here in Calgary. Now they have accommodations, I think near the university, right? So anyway, without so much ado, I would like to introduce to you Monsignor Fred Nolan, speaking about family matters here. Thank you.
As a way of making sure that the sound works well, I'm going to tell you a very brief story about 20 years ago when I was staying at Sacred Heart with Father Edmund. I called a friend working downtown, someone we went to school together 40 years ago, and he answered the phone and he said, "Hi, Fred." And I was baffled. I said, "How did you know it was me?" And here's a businessman who on his phone, the screen it said, Sacred Heart. And he said, "You can believe me. You're the only person I know who's going to call me from a Sacred Heart." So is the sound working okay? Is everyone happy? In the farthest corners, the farthest reaches? Well, our topic this evening could not be more important because of the impact on society. And that is building strong families. And so this is a chance for us to come up with a strategy for ourselves, for the next generation, for your grandchildren, how to go about building strong families. Obviously, the topic is vast, so don't get upset if I don't reach there are a million permutations. We'll talk about the basics. I think one of the most important points is that it is incredibly important for society, for the church, and for that reason you can say it is the most important investment of time and interest that you could possibly make. Building, raising a family, creating a really strong, firm family takes time. It takes a lot of sacrifice. This afternoon, we had a little luncheon conference, and someone asked the father of a family who has done a terrific job, he and his wife. And we said, "What was your secret?" He said, "Well, to be quite honest, A, the grace of God, but B, spending tons of time with the boys." They had 4 sons as they were growing up. There are no shortcuts. Along those lines, I was speaking recently with someone who is now 80 years old, and he said that he has in his possession the book that his father read to him every night for 10 minutes when he was 4 years old, which is roughly 76 years ago. And he knows the book by heart. Well, that takes time. And so that the very first point is the time, the interest, to pass on, to form a solid family. As the Holy Father says in one of his recent documents, no family drops down from heaven perfectly formed. Families need constantly to grow and mature in the ability to love. A very important point is how we look at each member of the family. How the parents look at each one of their children, how each spouse looks at the other. Do we look at each other with optimism, with this attitude, I am on your side? Or do we look at the kids, for example, with irritation, with frustration? That, of course, would be a tragedy, but it's worth mentioning. You may have come across the anecdote about the creation by Michelangelo of David, one of the most important sculptures in history. Right around the turn of the 15th century, the very young Michelangelo was hired by the city of Florence to create a very, very tall statue. I believe it's 8 meters high. Well, he took the city, they said to him, we have a block of marble in the backyard. It's been there for 50 years. 2 different sculptors have taken a shot at it, and they could not make it work because it's a very strange shape of marble. When Michelangelo looked at it, he didn't see a block of marble, he saw David. So his attitude was, okay, David's in there, I have to remove the excess. So he started removing the excess, and we end up with a masterpiece. It has everything to do with the way we look at people around us, especially family members. You might look at a young teenager, and maybe the first thought that comes to mind is blockhead, which is understandable. But if we have this attitude that this is a masterpiece in the making, at this moment he or she is 14, 15, 16, all sorts of everything you can imagine. But if we can find a way to say to that person, I love you, I'm on your side, I think you're the best, you are going to be a great human being, you already are, let's work on this together, I love being in your presence, that changes everything. And that, by the way, as you can easily imagine, is more necessary than ever for the young ones to hear. They need the words of encouragement because they are subjected to so much pressure and so many negative influences. Very much part of that whole chapter is the importance of accepting people as they are. This is the huge chapter of identifying and respecting different temperaments. I'll never forget the input from parents of a rather large family who said that they were just so sorry that they learned too late about a certain book called The Temperament That God Gave You. Because as they started reading through that book and learning about the different temperaments, they realized that all those years they had been dealing with each one of their children in the same way. You can't do that. Because a certain melancholic temperament will not respond the same way that a sanguine temperament responds. And if we don't realize that, and if we don't allow for that and accept that, recognize those different temperaments, there could be an awful lot of frustration. There's a professor in Montreal who has studied introverts and extroverts. This is going off a little bit of topic, but it's very interesting because he has discovered, interviewing a lot of different leaders, you have to recognize what kind of type of person is on your team. So his advice to people is, if they're in an important meeting, and the boss says to someone who is an extrovert, what do you think? the extrovert is going to start speaking immediately, without thinking. And so the advice is, don't trust what that person says, because no thought has gone into it. If you turn to an introvert and say, what do you think? The introvert will blush, will stammer. So don't do that. Don't put them on the spot. Instead, say, okay, folks, here's what we have to figure out. Let me know what you think in 3 days. Then the extrovert will have thought about it. The introvert will supply something that is really well thought out and right on the money. So going back to the family, there at the dinner table, different children, different temperaments will respond in a different way. One of the Holy Father's recent topics has been how to deal with difficulties. Difficulties come up all the time. He says in one of his documents, love does not have to be perfect for us to value it. The big enemy is to give too much importance to defects, to really be bothered by someone else's defects and let the frustration show. I'm the oldest of 6, and my youngest brother, my baby brother, who was born in 1960, is a very renowned photographer. He just published a book with a title that I just love. It's called The Perfect Imperfect. 35 years of being a highfalutin wedding photographer. The reason for the title is that his specialty is inserting himself into a wedding party and disappearing. I think he has a cloak he puts over so he disappears. No one realizes he's there. So he gets all these incredible shots of the imperfect, which is why they're so wonderful. Well, that is a microcosm of the family. And if we are expecting the perfect, typical, Sunday morning, getting the kids ready for Mass, if you're expecting the perfect, you're in the wrong business, because it ain't going to happen, to use terrible English. Things are going to go wrong. So the Holy Father, going back to this, he says, the other person loves me as best they can with all their limits. But the fact that love is imperfect does not mean that it is untrue or unreal. It is real, even though it's limited and earthly. If I expect too much, the other person will let me know. For he or she can neither play God nor serve all my needs. Love coexists with imperfection. Well, that's wonderful. And that lets us off the hook because God only knows how imperfect we are. So to the extent that we recognize our own imperfections, our own frailties, we can then be understanding with regard to the frailties of those around us. Married couples joined by love speak well of each other. They try to show their spouse's good side, not their weaknesses, not their faults. In any event, they keep silent rather than speak ill of them. Now you see, I'm taking some quotations from the Holy Father that I found very powerful. This one is really powerful. And it brought to mind a rather shocking thing, so fasten your seatbelt. Finding out recently about a marriage prep course given by an experienced married couple. The woman of the couple, she said Her attitude is, when she's with her friends, if she were to speak badly, negatively about her husband, she would be unfaithful, which is a pretty strong way of putting it. But I think it's a very important way, because it's a lack of loyalty. And that's exactly what the Holy Father is saying. They try to show their spouses a good side, not their weakness and faults. One of my favorite points from Amoris Laetitia, The Joy of Love, is the following call to arms, where the Holy Father says, "A love that is weak or infirm, incapable of accepting marriage as a challenge to be taken up and fought for, reborn, renewed, and reinvented until death, that love cannot sustain a great commitment. If that love is so weak and so sickly that people don't fight for it, it will fall victim to the culture of the ephemeral." This is really important for us, especially if we're giving advice to people we know who are wavering in their marriage. First of all, they won't know what the word ephemeral means, and we can spell it for them, but just because let's face it. But we live in a very ephemeral culture where things are here today and then they're gone the next day. The Holy Father is saying, you have to fight for that thing. You have to fight for that relationship. You have to look for ways of taking up the challenge, rebirthing, renewing that commitment, reinventing it until death. There was a great article some years ago with a very provocative title. I think the title was more or less, I have been married to 3 different people. The same person. But the whole point of the article was she was saying, the man I married at the age of 24 was so-and-so. When he was 45, he was a very different person. I was different. And when he was 65, the two of us were totally different, which is what happens. But what a shame if that at the age of 27, they just said, well, we'll go our separate ways. A biggie is knowing how to express our gratitude every day. And this is especially for the men. Ladies, you're going to be very shocked by this revelation, but you're old enough to handle it. But men will say, I told her, I think in 2019, that I was very grateful. I said, look, blockhead, or maybe knucklehead, every day you have to say to your wife, you really appreciate everything about her. She's gorgeous, the list goes on and on. Yeah, but I told her a month ago, tell her again tomorrow. Because we can't take each other for granted. The Holy Father says, a look of appreciation has enormous importance, and to begrudge it is usually hurtful. It is usually hurtful. Much hurt, many problems result when we stop looking at one another. Then the Holy Father offers some different quotes. My husband no longer looks at me. He acts as if I were invisible. Or, please look at me when I'm talking to you. My wife no longer looks at me. She only has eyes for our children. Well, these are painful quotes. And they happen. Which is why we go back to the original point. This marriage takes a real investment of time. And it requires this attitude, this is it. This is the big leagues. which brings us to the next point, which is communication. Communication, especially between spouses, but also with the rest of the gang at home. We really have to get better at listening. This is number 137 from Amoris Laetitia. Take time, quality time. This means putting down the phone, putting it on airplane mode, removing any possible distractions. This means being ready to listen patiently and attentively to everything the other person wants to say. It requires the self-discipline of not speaking until the time is right. I think during these coming days, as the fruit of this time of prayer together, when we try it, we will be amazed. When we just say to ourselves, I refuse to say a single word until I know that that other person has said everything that he or she wants to say. It works like a charm for a very basic reason. If the other person assumes that we're about to cut them off, interrupt them or roll our eyes or anything like that, we will never find out what they were thinking, because they were just testing to see if we were going to listen. But if we're listening and staring and there are no distractions whatsoever, and they see, they're judging, reading our eyes, we're not saying a word, great things happen. And then we find out really what they were thinking. Instead of offering an opinion or advice, we need to be sure we have heard everything the other person has to say. This means cultivating an interior silence that makes it possible to listen to the other person without mental or emotional distractions. Do not be rushed. Put aside all of your own needs and worries and make space. This also really it applies to the young ones in the house. And again, the same point. It takes a big investment, huge investment of time, patience, patience that will bear fruit over for centuries to come. A very special context for this is dinner table conversation. It is vitally important to have dinner table conversation, which means you have to have a dinner table, you have to have food on it, you have to have conversation. Which means no distractions. We have a student residence in Toronto, a girls' residence, where the girls themselves, they came up with a great rule of thumb, because they craved attentive listeners. So they put a basket outside the dining room. They said, check your weapons at the door. And then if anyone dared to bring in her phone, and during the meal conversation, if she dared to pull it out and look at it, 10 push-ups on the spot, in front of everybody watching. And they loved it so much, not the push-ups, but having attentive listeners, that they got to the point where whenever several of them would go for a cup of coffee down the street, same thing, they would do 10 push-ups in the middle of Tim Hortons, which quite a spectacle, especially if you can't do 10 push-ups. But what a wonderful thing if the kids at the table see in your eyes immense respect for whatever they want to talk about. That'll be unbelievable. And they will never forget that. So on the downside of that, enemy number one is what someone has called permanent partial attention, which is a major malady of our times. Basically, people just being constantly distracted. It's agony. You'll be fascinated to know that 6 or 7 years ago, a young professor at Yale University offered a course on happiness. They started off in a small classroom, and over the period of several days, she kept being given a bigger and bigger and bigger. She ended up in a place bigger than this. It was the most popular course ever in Yale's long history. For that year, a third of the entire student body attended that class, which is unbelievable. Well, a month ago, she published another article, and this one's on anxiety. And in it, she explains that when she looks out at these undergrads and looks into their face and listens to them, she sees anxiety. And where does it come from? From hours and hours and hours on the screen. Especially with teenage girls and girls in their early 20s, spending hours on Instagram comparing themselves to others, which is absolutely deadly. And in this article, she offers what she called, whoever came up with this, the 3 W's. She says to the students, if you reach for your phone, ask yourself, what for, why now, and what else? In the first place, what for? When you pick up your phone, what was that for? Was there a purpose? The next question is, why now? Did you really have something to do, or were you bored or anxious, or fighting some craving, or even worse, were you falling into an addiction? And finally, what else? Opportunity cost. Think about it. Those 2 hours you've spent on Twitter, whatever it is, those 2 hours are gone. And if you're 16 years old, that's a major portion of your life. During those 2 hours, you could have been talking to a human being. You could have been working. You could have read 5 chapters of War and Peace. You could have changed the oil in your car. You could have done something useful. But those 2 hours are gone, and you walk away from it with 0. I just have a couple of more points, and then we'll open up for any questions or comments. Going back to the marriage prep course that I mentioned, one of the other incredibly important bits of advice from this experienced couple, they said that early on in their marriage they had come to the agreement, no bazookas. So of course everyone says, well, what does that mean? Well, this couple said, well, a bazooka is a long, long pipe. It's a missile launcher. It goes way back and then zoom. And so when a couple gets in an argument, none of this reaching way back into something that happened in 2013 and bringing it back up. No bazookas. Which brought to mind something that I read in this book you may have come across called The 12 Rules by Jordan Peterson. He says the same thing, but here's how he puts it. You have to consciously define the topic of a conversation, particularly when it is difficult. Otherwise, that conversation becomes about everything, and everything is too much. This is so frequently why couples cease communicating. You remember that he is a clinical psychologist. Every argument degenerates into every problem that ever emerged in the past. Every problem that exists now, every terrible thing that is likely to happen in the future. But no one can have a discussion about everything. Instead, you can say, this exact, precise thing, you left the car on empty. This is what makes me unhappy. But to do that, you have to think, What is wrong exactly? What do I want exactly? You must speak forthrightly. You must use honest, precise speech to do that. But then he finishes by saying, if instead you shrink away and hide, what you are hiding from will transform itself into the giant dragon that lurks under your bed and in your forest and in the dark recesses of your mind, and it will devour you. The final point I want to make is about our elders, about grandparents. The grandparents have to tell stories. We have to encourage our parents, our grandparents to tell stories. Just 3 days ago in Vancouver, I was with someone who is now 97, sharp as a whip, with his son who's my age. And on the wall behind him was a whole frame of all the medals that he earned fighting in Belgium and in the Netherlands and in Germany during World War II. And he made the remark, when I'm gone, they'll probably throw them away. So I asked him, well, you have taped an explanation of what they're about, right? He said, no. So then, by the end of that conversation, the son said, we're going to do it. Once they're gone, it's gone. And that is part of our roots. So we have to make sure that happens. So I want to share with you as the final thing, the final parting shot, one of my favorite heirlooms. Because my mother, who was the youngest of 7, born in 1930 in Birmingham, Alabama, came across her mother's diary. And so we got a page from it when my mother was 5 years old. So it was 1935. The aftermath was still in the throes of the Depression, the Great Depression. And just a few diary entries that are precious. September 23rd, no word from Frank, her husband, my grandfather, no word from him yesterday. He was traveling all over the U.S. trying to sell life insurance, but nobody had any money. We have no money. I redeemed milk bottles this morning for breakfast food. I'm all upset inside, waiting, hoping for some word. I've placed all my affairs in the hands of the Father, of God the Father. I know things will be all right. Then later that day she writes, my prayers were answered. We had 2 letters from Frank in the morning mail with money enclosed. The cloud is lifting. I went to see Greta Garbo and Anna Karenina. I find that incredibly charming. Then November 18th, after days and days of rain, the sun shines again. One of the chickens died, but the family will not eat it. Cluck, the other chicken, still walks around the coop looking very lonely. Then the final one, 3 days later, praise God for the 2 quarts of milk left by the dairyman this morning. I was broke. He said he was going to leave us milk every morning. This is another evidence of God's goodness. Well, I treasure this because it just shows where resilience comes from. This is unbelievable. And I'm sure each one of you can tell all sorts of stories. These are very precious, and we can't lose track of them. So now, if anyone would like to make any comments, questions, complaints, the mic is right there. Or you can just stand up, because we're not all that many. And thank you for patience. Yes, ma'am.
Kids who get in trouble with the law, and all the torture that goes on with that, and the sleepless nights, and so on. I am so grateful and happy that has happened to me, that I have just those kids billions of people in this world, and I'm the only one who gets to be the mom of them. They are the most wonderful children in the world, and to me. And I'm just, it's like, it's a beautiful adventure, and I'm not saying that I don't lay awake at night, including last night and the night before, arguing in my mind, but, and struggling against the injustices, but still it's a privilege. I guess that's what I want to say. It's an incredible privilege. And so don't be afraid when things start going wrong, but speak up, don't stay silent. Don't say, this is really shameful, like I wouldn't want to embarrass my family. I can't talk about this, I can't talk about it. Don't do that. Ask for help. So that's it.
Father Edmund, you're a man of great experience. Do you have any comments?
Not sure. I'm an introvert, so. I'm kidding.
Because if there are no questions or comments, we can finish, and then I can just be up here and answer anything. Yes, sir.
Are it's referred to as gray divorce, that those who married 20 years and more is the fastest growing number of people divorcing. And it seems to me that there's a growing incidence of alienation and of a dying of love that happens in marriages. And often it happens, it seems, through the crucible of the high school years, when there are all kinds of crises that adolescents face, and often the mother becomes deeply absorbed in those, and the father is often left marginalized. And after the children are gone off to college or graduated college, that there's an unraveling of the marriage. Be interested in your thoughts on how that can be remedied.
So I'll be really honest. That up here, for whatever reason, I found that very hard to follow because of the acoustics, whatever. But does the basic question have to do with the kids in high school becoming alienated? Maybe it was the way you were holding your mic. I don't know.
It's the wife becoming alienated or disenchanted with the husband, that the wife becomes absorbed in the struggles of the adolescence and the husband is left marginalized.
Wow, that's a terrific question. I'm sure a lot of you have tremendous experience to pass along. I think a lot of it has to be that from the very beginning, the husband and wife go at this project in a very studied way, thinking, reading, being formed on how to be parents. I mean, they have to be working in sync. And you'll be interested to know that quite a few years ago, some members of Opus Dei started an organization precisely to give formation to young couples, in which they use the case study method in order to take a look at different scenarios that can come up. What do you do when your 16-year-old does this? They study it, then they get together, maybe a group of 8 or 9 or 10 couples, and they work on it. And they get both the men and the women thinking, what do? We have to think about this. This is going to happen. We have to get ready. Before I forget, on the website of the parish, there will be I think I listed 5 different resources. One of them that comes to mind in this context is a very spooky documentary called Childhood 2.0, which I think is important for you to see, especially if you have teenagers. We, meaning anyone over 25, we have no idea what teenagers are going through now, what they're seeing on their phones, and it is really unbelievable. Just to give you a little aperitif, the elderly woman who's 30, who's interviewing a 16-year-old, elderly, different generation, she says, so talk about dating. And the girls, the 16-year-olds, oh, we don't date. I suddenly get a message from somebody, I have no idea who he is. He says, you're hot. So I respond, and then we start going back and forth. They've never seen each other. Weird. I mean, it's weird. Now, maybe this is just in the United States, but I doubt it. The other very important thing on the website, coming up in I think the first weekend in June, is an international digital conference on sexuality and affectivity with some tremendous speakers from all over the world. I've looked at the topics they're going to take a look at, and they're really important. I mean, obvious ones and ones that are not so obvious. At what age should you give your child a telephone, for example? So you'll see on the website the link and how to sign up for that. That's really good. Now, I know I have not answered your question yet. It's a really interesting question. Anybody have any insights? Great. Here comes the mic. I have a feeling with this mic you have to hold it. We'll have to take it. We'll experiment.
Thank you. I'm Mark. I'm married and I have 2 kids. And I've experienced what you talked about. My kids now are grown. Son is 27, my daughter's 25, and both live away. And they were really, really busy, and with school, with activities, with everything. We had basically a 3-level, academics first, music second, and then your recreation. My son was a basketball player, my daughter was a dancer. Both did piano, my daughter did voice, my son did percussion, and then school. My wife and I were busy. We were going in every direction. And, I think the key was we took a team approach. We only had 2 kids, so if you've got more than 2 kids, you got to come up with a zone defense or something. But, it was either I took my daughter or my son, and she took the other one, activities, drove, did whatever. Activities that were important that we both had to be at, parent-teacher interviews, they were great. But, the time, it was for sure that there was a shortage of time with just me and my wife and getting to know each other. But the key was to never, at least I never did, and I don't think she did either, take it personally, as if you're in competition with your kids, because you're not in competition with your kids. You're working together, part of the team, the whole family. And there was nothing wrong with actually verbalizing if you're feeling like you're being neglected and that you need some time. Now, we weren't perfect. I don't think anybody's perfect. But looking back, yeah, we should have made more time for just each other. But when the kids went away to school, both of them went away to university, we had the empty nest earlier than You know, once they go away to university, they're basically gone. They come home for summers, doing laundry, stuff like that, pick up food. But it took some time. I mean, I felt emptiness because I was really involved, and my wife was really involved too. But we have a great relationship with the kids, and I have a great relationship with my wife, and I think it's improving all the time. But it doesn't just happen. We've got to work on it. And again, not take things personally, particularly when they're not intended personally. So that's all I have. You want it. You get a bigger voice.
I'm Mary Voss. I belong to this parish. I love it. I'm 91 years old. I have 11 children, 51 grandchildren, and 26 great-grandchildren. So we have procreated. Doesn't need that. My husband died about 7 years ago, but one of the things that we were intent on was praying together. And so I'm saying to you couples, one, reach out to the other and say, we have got to do this. We have got to pray together, because that is a secret. I do not know any mother or father who doesn't say at the end of their life, I wish I had been a better mother and father. So do the best you can. Okay? I don't think we can reach that far.
My name is Finri. I am a crisis counselor, so I worked with many of the families with communication and difficulties, and how the children are struggling each time when they are having a difficulty in the family that will affect to the children too. So many of the times I have seen there is no open communication between the father and the mother. So what does that mean? I encourage most of the families to sit together by end of the day to communicate each other, right? So most of the time it's very difficult for the families to communicate. And I don't know if you are aware of these things. It's a five love language is very important. That may be physical touch, or just sitting beside it, or talking, or different. When you search it, you can see it. So it helped many of my families to work together it and deal with it, as well as trying to identify what is triggering during that time, and taking an action towards it. So if someone is talking to me, my husband or someone is talking to me, it is a trigger for me. I have to identify what is going on with me, and I have to find a way to manage that situation, to move out from that situation, or talk in a later situation where that person is calm or anything like that.
You can track down the thingy. Good. So I'm going to call to a close our session. I'm going to stay here as long as anybody wants to come up and... Yes, sir.
I was just hoping you could comment on, I know that St. Josemaria speaks a lot about friendship with children, but how, could you maybe comment on how friendship with children changes when they're young, when they're teenagers, and then when they're adults, maybe even married with other children themselves, and how our relationship with them, specifically as friends, parents to children, changes over the years?
So what are your instincts?
So,
Because you're good at this.
So to me, the first thing is liking what they like, you know, just being close to their interests, I think, is the first thing. And then trying to follow, I guess, as they're getting older, making sure that the foundation is there from the beginning so they know to come to me to talk about things. So that's for me as a father, that I want them to be my friend, they know they can talk to Dad about stuff.
I can tell you a couple of vignettes that I'll never forget. I can remember my dad, so I was 10, helping me to get ready to be an altar boy. So we would rehearse the responses in Latin, because we're going back. And then I would be assigned 6:15 Mass Monday through Friday, every maybe once a month. So every morning for a week we would go to Mass together, 6:15. This is when boys were boys and men were men. This is tough, but always there. And then so many vignettes. Well, the other one, sorry to be so personal, but these are really powerful. I must have been 6. Sunday Mass, everyone had left. The two of us were the only ones there. He had his head in his hands, and so I got nervous. I said, "What's wrong?" He said, "Nothing. I'm talking to Jesus." And I remember thinking, now that is cool. That is big. This is a long time ago. Then we would go pick up my grandfather, go to the Tasty Diner in Bethesda, Maryland, sit at the same booth each time. So I went back last October for my 50th high school reunion, delayed by a year. And one of my 2 brothers came down from New Jersey. We went Saturday morning to the same diner, the same booth. The cook had changed, but not too much else. We've been going there for 60 years. So all these things, all roots. I think another one I meant to mention earlier, the dads they cannot imagine the importance of taking one of the children, say, let's go to the hardware store. Let's study what needs to be done, change a light bulb, or fix something. Let's go to the hardware store, let's do it. You pay, here's the money, you deal with the clerk, and then let's do it and finish things well. Because for that child, that'll be a major part of his or her life. And they'll never forget that one episode. So as they grow into teenage years, the same thing really. I think it's a more mature conversation. I think that the key thing is whatever the age, when they see in the eyes of their mother or father a great deal of love, confidence in them, and ready to welcome them back when they make a big mistake, it's fantastic. Does that ring true? Yeah. But each one of you could tell 1,000 stories like that. Very precious. Right. So I would like to end then with a little prayer, praying for each one of you and for each one of your families, each one of the families right now, but also looking way ahead. Because God only knows with the way that God works, maybe something that we heard this evening, whether it was actually said or not, doesn't matter. If we heard it, maybe that will set in motion a change that will have an impact 200 years from now. So I'm going to end, this is really bad of me, but I'm going to end with one final anecdote. This is half Irish, so that's why we gift of the gab. You all have probably seen the movie about Mr. Rogers. Or when you were growing up, you watched Mr. Rogers. I read a very charming anecdote about his days in Presbyterian seminary. So as you know, as you can imagine, they study homiletics very seriously because they're expected to give a 45-minute homily, so that it better be really good. One day he went to hear a famous homilist speak. The homilist did not show up. He was sick. So somebody else was parachuted in, and he was your basic train wreck. He was terrible. So as Fred Rogers was there listening, mentally he was saying, okay, he broke that rule, he broke that rule, he's breaking every rule in the book. So finally, mercifully, after 45 minutes, it ended. And Fred Rogers was about to turn to the lady next to him to say to her, thank God it's over. But he looked at her and he saw tears streaming down her face. And she said to him, that man said exactly what I needed to hear. So Mr. Rogers froze, and it changed his life. Because he realized one thing is what is said, such as this evening. Another thing is what is received, such as this evening. And in between, the Holy Spirit is going wild, thank God. So that my prayer is that who cares what was said today, but what you have heard, that it have a big impact. So thank you all, and thank you for your patience, and God bless each one of you. Thank you.
We'll continue with this celebration. We have coffee and biscuits. Protocol compliant. That's okay. Thank you for coming, and we thank